Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 7. Chapter 7 deals with understanding relationships. This chapter is very important and will help us to better understand the different things that go into the people that we choose to have relationships with, the different processes that relationships go through, and ways that we can work to have the best possible communication in our relationships. It's a very important chapter, and I think you'll get a lot from it. So let's get started. During this chapter, we will describe the various functions of relationships and the different kinds of human needs that they fulfill. We will also discuss the role that conversations and communication plays in relationships. We will explain how relationships can be different in terms of the amount of breadth and depth that they cover. So the idea of breadth deals with the number of topics that we might talk about with someone, whereas depth deals with the level of detail and the amount of sharing that we do with regards to those topics. We're also going to analyze the relationship and the relationship process using the theories of stages of relationship development, the cost-benefit social exchange theory, and the relational dialectics approach. Each of these theories provides valuable frameworks for understanding how relationships develop and progress and evolve. In addition, this chapter will explain the relationship between trust and relationship development. We will also look at the way that conversations help to facilitate the development of trust in relationships. And finally, we will discuss optimum and ideal approaches to improving interpersonal relationships through communication. So let's get started. So what do we mean when we talk about an interpersonal relationship? Well, an interpersonal relationship deals with these relationships where we have meaningful connections with people that are close, and usually there is a past and a present, and it's presumed that there will be a future relationship. So we can distinguish interpersonal relationships between two people that we might have with close friends, family, or our partners in life, right? We can distinguish the interpersonal close connection that we have with these people to the kinds of impersonal relationships that we might have, for example, with the grocery checkout person or the postal person at the US Postal Service, or any number of people who occupy our daily interactions, but we don't have a close relationship with them. We might also be able to compare interpersonal relationships with professional relationships. Professional relationships are centered on the idea that people come together in order to achieve and accomplish a professional goal. Oftentimes, this includes working with other people in the organization. I have specified many times so far in this course the ideal ways that we should approach optimum professional communication. So I think it's a good thing for us to be conscious and mindful of the kinds of relationships that we're in when we're communicating with people. So as we would be disclosing feelings or experiences or asking people to spend time with us in interpersonal relationships, the professional relationship is one that typically should not involve a bunch of personal disclosing or sharing of a lot of feelings or personal experiences. Now, in some situations, it's appropriate for people in the professional environment to draw on personal experiences in order to connect with clients, but we should always be very mindful that we are communicating appropriately given the nature of the relationship with the person that we're talking with. All of us have emotional and affection needs that are met through effective relationships. According to William Schutz, we can look at relationships from his FIRO theory, which includes the fundamental interpersonal relations orientation theory. What this suggests is that all people have the need for things like inclusion, control, and affection. Inclusion deals with our need for social contact, And it gives us a sense of feeling like we're in with people, like we belong. However, the opposite of feeling inclusion is the sad experience of loneliness. And loneliness deals with the perceived discrepancy or difference between what we would like in our life in terms of relationships or the closeness in relationships and what we actually have, right? So loneliness can deal with wanting more friends or perhaps wanting closer connections with the friends that you have, right? Loneliness could deal with wanting to have a partner in life or perhaps wanting a closer connection with the partner that you have. So it's interesting to think about people who are already in relationships actually experiencing loneliness. And your book mentions the fact that loneliness is really, really bad for your health. Research has shown, for example, that men who are aged 50 and older who do not have close friends or relatives are 3 times as likely to die from some kind of a physical condition than people who do have close connections. We can also think of how the internet may contribute to feelings of loneliness. You're always connected to people you know and are quote unquote friends with, but the actual interpersonal process of face-to-face communication and support and the rewards that go with that in terms of feeling inclusion and affection no longer are as present as they were before in society. Schutt's theory also looked at the process or the need that people have to feel as if they have control in terms of being capable and responsible to achieve the goals that they set forth in their life, whether they are goals related to accomplishment or goals related to relationships. Control also relates to our need to feel that we have influence in our life and influence towards other people in our relationships. And so this is one of the reasons why in marital counseling, a lot of times couples will start to talk about issues of power or power struggles in the relationship. These are issues, relational needs that are related to the human's need to have control in their life and in their relationship. But we also need affection, and affection deals with building those emotional connections with people that give us somewhere safe where we can go when life gets hard, where we feel like we have someone we can go to who's going to be there for us, who loves us unconditionally, who accepts us unconditionally. And these kinds of emotional connections allow people to feel that they are being loved. And feeling loved is extremely important in terms of feeling fulfilled in your life. Now, some of us come from homes where we got all of our relational affection and control needs modeled effectively by parents or caregivers, and we were also shown that we were lovable and worthy of love and that we were good people and all of these really good things that help people to develop a positive sense of self, right? So those of us that have experienced that are probably more comfortable in interpersonal close relationships because we have experienced that with our close family in the past or people that have raised us and cared for us. However, some people come from homes where they are not provided with the unconditional support and love and affection that they need in order to become fully functional, emotional human beings. So what this means is that for people that come from environments that were less accepting and loving and affectionate, that means that those folks may need to work a little bit more in terms of cultivating a sense of love for themselves and a sense of belief that they are worthy of love and that they are capable of being in a close, loving relationship. So I think that this is something that's really good for all of us to consider. And in some situations, we may have gotten inconsistent nurturing in terms of control and affection and things like and inclusion, right? So these are the kinds of environments where many of our needs were met, and yet there were certain times where, there were situations that, perhaps parents did not have control over, which, caused them to not be there for their children in certain cases. And sometimes those inconsistent situations can also influence the way that people develop. This might also play out, for example, with children who grow up in an environment where mom or dad passes away unexpectedly. So, that child is left dealing with all of these needs that, their one parent was meeting. And now the one parent that is left is expected to try to meet all of these needs, that basically two parents were meeting before. So children who go through that may struggle with this. Also, if you grew up or someone who grew up in an environment where there was addiction in the home, what this often contributes is that the parent who is dealing with addiction is not able to fulfill the needs of the children in the home the way that a more mentally fit person can. So these are all issues that we want to be conscious of. I encourage you to think back on your childhood and think about the positive messages that you received about these issues. And you could also think, well, were there any instances where I felt like I didn't get my needs met? And what perhaps was the impact on me? This is also something, if you find that you're struggling with some of these issues, this is a great topic to take up with professional counseling. And these issues can really be identified and resolved through the coaching of a professional counselor who knows how to help with that. One theory that allows us to look at relationship development is the social penetration theory. This theory suggests that relationships begin with narrow breadth. So what that means is we have a few topics we might talk about, and shallow depth. And over time, we may develop a closer relationship, which might increase the breadth of the topics that we talk about, or also allow us to go into deeper or more in-depth explanation and discussion with people about personal thoughts, feelings, and needs. So according to this theory, when we first meet people that we know, we might just have a few topics that we talk about, and these are called the safe zone topics. So things like the weather, or things like, oh, what classes are you taking? Or, oh, what do you think about, that sports team, or something like that. And then as we develop a closer relationship, then we would not only increase the number of topics that we discuss, but we would also expect that the closer we get, that we will talk more closely and more in depth about how we feel about various issues, our experiences, our feelings, our needs, and things that maybe we've been through in life. So we're going to look at a model of this theory here on the next slide, and it will allow you to visualize this process taking place. Figure 7.1 allows us to visualize the relational breadth and topic depth development that can happen over the course of a relationship progression. So at the top of the circle, you can see the word breadth, and what we see underneath it is that there's topic A, topic B, topic C, and if you reference the topics under A, B, C, you'll see that there's a reference list at the bottom of the circle. So topic A might be leisure. What are you going to do this weekend? Do you have any fun plans? Topic B might be career goals, right? Topic C might be relationships with friends. And the assumption here is that the more that we get to know people, the more that we will explore various topics, especially as they may progress towards being more personal, right? So if you look at leisure, for example, and career goals, you can see that those issues are not nearly as personal as something like romance or various secrets that you might be having, right? So we can think about that, and we can know, for example, that you might meet many people at school or at work or people in the community, and you may only discuss topic A and topic B. And because of the nature of the relationship that you share with them, let's say it's a professional relationship, you may never go beyond topic A and topic B with this person, right? And you may just stay there, and you may also not go very deep in terms of how much personal information you share about those things. So on the left of the circle, you can see that the notion of depth is being indicated. We can see that the most depth that we can create in a conversation would be going through each of the stages, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like an onion, until we get to the middle of the model, which indicates that we are the most open and the most disclosing that we are with anyone with these people, okay? So you can also know that there might be a lot of people where you learn a little bit about topic A and topic B, and you have no intention or even desire of getting to know them anymore beyond that. And so this model allows us to see the way that we sort of stick our toe in the water, so to speak, and we experiment with certain topics to see if there are, if there's enough similarity there for us to want to continue in terms of getting to know each other further. So obviously the process of self-disclosure or sharing your thoughts, feelings, experiences with another human being will affect both the breadth of the topics that we discuss and the depth in which we share during those discussions. The process of self-disclosure allows us to reveal ourselves to another person, information about ourselves that other people would otherwise not be privileged to know. Now, self-disclosure has a fairly natural progression in a lot of relationships. Typically, we tend to self-disclose a little bit at a time, and then we tend to see if other people reciprocate with self-disclosure as well. Now, we may find ourselves in situations sometimes where perhaps someone is an oversharer or they self-disclose excessively, and it may put us in a challenging situation because what do you do, for instance, if somebody self-discloses a lot of information to you that you don't really feel is appropriate, and then it almost feels as if they expect that you are also going to disclose something to them of the same depth, right? So it's always good to be mindful of the fact that self-disclosure is something that not only can bring us closer together, because if you do trust somebody by sharing a little bit of personal information, you can certainly see how they respond to that or what they do with the information. However, we also want to be aware that self-disclosure can also lead to feelings of awkwardness or sometimes inappropriate revealing if people share too much information that is not appropriate for the communication environment. So in general, it is good to be open with who you are, but I would always, again, caution people before you engage in some kind of a self-disclosure that is fairly deep, you want to probably consider whether this is an appropriate disclosure for the communication environment. And you may want to ask yourself, why am I sharing this information with the person? And is this a good use of information in this relationship, or should I be maybe focusing on something else, or perhaps being conscious of what your intentions are in a conversation where you do self-disclose? Another thing that relates to disclosure in relationships deals with people's very real need for privacy, and this can include the types of topics that we discuss and also the level of depth that we may share. So the communication privacy management theory addresses the way in which people establish borders and boundaries within their relationships. And we all have different ideas about what is considered to be, inappropriate or a realistic or sort of a reasonable boundary. So your book talks about the fact that sometimes couples, for example, may run into challenges when one person wants to know a piece of information or a set of pieces of information that the other person does not want to discuss. These are things that are able to be resolved if you are able to have mutual respect for your friends or your partners or whoever it is that you're talking with. I think that trying to keep an open mind and trying to understand where people are coming from, especially when their opinions and their decisions differ from ours, is always a challenging thing. But ultimately, in terms of relationships, trying to take the perspective of the other person and giving people mutual respect, and of course them giving us respect, is really the best way to go for the most positive relationship outcomes. According to the relationship stage model in your book, most relationships go through various stages. So we can look at the first stage, which is the initiation stage, and this is where contact is first made. So you might just say something like, hello, aloha, how are you doing today? What's new? You might be sitting next to somebody in a class. This is really just the first few words or phrases that people might say to each other. Next comes the experimenting stage. This is where we begin to probe the unknown. We often do this through small talk, and small talk allows us to learn about people and helps us to assess whether we have enough in common where we would want to continue to have conversations with them and possibly even build a closer relationship. So small talk might take the form of, let's discuss, the weather, or maybe you're talking about, perhaps what you think of a certain class, or maybe what did you do this weekend? These are all different types of small talk conversations that people might have. And you can tell a lot about somebody just by talking about a few of those topics, because you would get more information, which would allow you to tell, do you have anything in common with this person? Do they have a similar lifestyle as you? And do we have similar values, right? So you can think about this. You can also tell a lot about people's attitudes just by having a very superficial conversation about the weather, or about the way that they view the professor, or about what they did for the weekend, right? You can ask them, what did you do this weekend? And you can tell a lot about someone's lifestyle just by what they say. Once we get to stage 3, this is where people begin to intensify their relationship. And in intensifying, people are becoming good friends. So at this stage, people are starting to share about those topics that are more personal, and they may share more information, and they're learning to build trust with each other. And this is also where people may start to become better at predicting each other's behavior. They may adopt nicknames for each other, or wear similar clothing, or different kinds of things like that. And at this stage, the I that each of those people had before they became good friends is turning into a we sense of identity. The integrating stage is stage 4, and in this stage, this is basically where people who used to identify as two individuals are now very solidly a team, or a couple, or a package. This can relate to friends or romantic partners or what have you. And at this stage, you probably will hear people saying things like, oh, well, we love that restaurant, and we loved that movie, and this week we are going on vacation, and things like that. So there's a very clear marking that these two people are alike. People may begin to speak more and more similarly. You may pick up mannerisms from somebody that you are integrating with, even if you're just friends, right? And people may, have certain songs that represent really poignant or important moments in their life, and that song is always going to be their song. This is the kind of thing that happens in the integrating stage. And I think it's important to remember that a relationship does not always necessarily progress through each of the stages that we are going to talk about here today. So I would say that there might be many friendships that get to the integrating phase, and people are good friends for a long time. And then what ends up happening is people might move away. And then once you move away, people have the best intentions, but the reality is that it's difficult to sustain a close relationship when people live in different places, right? So if people continue to stay integrated, and we can take the example, let's say, of a married couple, okay? Then if people continue to integrate as a couple, then they may go into stage 5, which is the bonding stage. This is where people make a formal commitment to each other. So they may institutionalize their relationship with a formal contract, such as a wedding license or a business contract. If they are like friends that are going to work together and start a business, that's what that would look like. And the relationship takes on new meaning and new character. And oftentimes people may have some challenges at this stage because people may have different expectations of what the bonding stage should look like in terms of the way that people relate to each other and their communication. So this is extremely important in terms of remembering that we all bring our own sets of expectations and experiences into relationships, and the only way to understand what people are thinking and share what we are thinking is through effective communication. So stage 6 allows us to look at what can happen when relationships do not stay as close as they were when people began to first get to know each other and progress towards a closer relationship. We can look at stage 6, for example, and stage 6 is the differentiation stage. At this point, people may identify more in terms of seeking to regain their individual identities. So, for example, you may have a couple that got married 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and they were able to have a lot of good communication surrounding the children while they were raising children together. And then what happens is perhaps the children grow up and are no longer there in the house anymore to be a focal point that people focus on, right? And so this might create more space in people's life, and they may seek to do different things that they used to like to do before they had kids. So maybe they want to take up a hobby that they used to love, or maybe they want to go back to school and get their education, or maybe they want to, live somewhere else than where they're currently living, right? So we can look at stage 6 as the process of beginning to differentiate and create our own identities again. The next stage is circumscribing. This is where the quality and the quantity of communication between two people decreases. This suggests that the enjoyment that people used to get from communicating with their relationship partners is not as satisfying. We also find that there may be certain areas that are off limits for discussion, and sometimes this can create, tension in the house, especially if one person, wants to discuss something and the other person doesn't. That can be fairly frustrating for people. So the circumscribing phase basically is where dynamic, ongoing communication has basically almost stopped. And your book says there's a lack of energy, shrinking interest, and a general feeling of exhaustion that tends to characterize the relationship. So I think at this stage, it's probably good to mention that the average American marriage lasts about 7 years, and 50% of first marriages will end in divorce, and 75% of second marriages will end in divorce. And so, unfortunately, the reality is that people tend to grow together in relationships for a time, and oftentimes many people grow apart as well. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where you're going through the stage 7, 8, 9, and 10, then, I think that it's really good to make sure that you have social support in place so that you have friends or family members that you can feel you can lean back on if there is a ending to a relationship that's coming, or even if the relationship that you plan to stay in has reached the differentiation or the circumscribing phase. Stage 8 deals with stagnation. This is basically where communication is at a standstill. There really isn't much communication taking place. This could be deliberate. Sometimes people might just avoid interacting because they think it's easier than having to worry about a conflict. When you think about stage 8, you can just think of stagnation, where people are maybe sitting on opposite sides of a stagnating pool of water, and nobody's really seeking to connect or communicate, and they're just kind of existing. Stage 9 is where participants actually intentionally begin to avoid having contact with another person, and people may do this for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they do it because it's become so unpleasant or so hurtful that they just can no longer move on like that. Other times, they really are trying to send a message to another person. So rather than breaking up with someone or ending a relationship, you may just not call them back, or may not respond to their text messages. You may just try not to be at home when they're there, right? You might just try to avoid them completely. I think it's also really important at this stage to identify that there are some relationships, romantic relationships, friendships, and even family relationships where people may go into the circumscribing, stagnating, and avoiding stages, and they may stay in those stages and yet continue to choose to stay in the relationship. So, for example, sometimes people who are still married after 20, 30, 40 years, 50 years, sometimes these people maybe do not have a lot of communication with each other. They may have not much communication at all, and they may purposely avoid each other because they have each cultivated their own lives separately from each other. However, due to financial limitations or not wanting to break up the family, or due to very traditional cultural values that look down on separating or divorcing a partner, they may avoid ending the relationship and just choose to stay in the avoiding stage until one or both people decease, right? So it's very good to be aware of that. And of course, you all saw that stage 10 was coming. This is the termination stage. This is where the relationship ends. And depending on the people involved and on the relationship that exists, the termination stage can be extremely short, or it can be very drawn out over time. And some people may choose to terminate a relationship in person. Other people may do it over the phone because they think it's easier. Other people may use an email or legal documents, right? But I think that it's just good to be aware of the fact that everyone has a different preference. Ideally, a face-to-face conversation is the most optimum, but it's also important to acknowledge that in some cases, you may not want to have to deal with a face-to-face conversation because somebody may get too upset, or they may have problems controlling their anger, or other issues like that. So these are the 10 stages, and we'll talk about this again on the next slide. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, Figure 7.3 allows you to look at the development of relational closeness, and they provide you with a model that mimics a staircase whereby the initiation phase starts on the bottom left and leads into the experimenting, and presuming that our conversations in experimenting go well and we approve of the person, then we get into the intensifying stage. The intensifying stage, presuming that we don't see some information at this point that makes us want to not be closer to someone, then we begin to integrate, and eventually some kind of a bonding stage will emerge. We can see, starting at the bonding at the top, that in some relationships, people may stay in the bonding stage forever. You may always be best friends with your best friend from kindergarten, right? It's possible, and this happens all the time. Also, people who are married may stay in the bonding, interconnected stage for the course of their marriage, right? They may always be in love. They may always stay committed and loyal, right? Even if maybe they go through some challenges in life, they always stay connected to that bond and to, that other person. However, in some cases, realistically, people don't always stay together, and so this leads to differentiation, which is defining ourselves as individuals again after considering ourselves as a part of a couple, which then of course leads to circumscribing, and eventually stagnating and avoiding, where we purposely go out of our way to avoid people, and then there is the termination of the relationship. A special case of relationship termination that needs to be discussed deals with a relationship that ends because of the death of someone we love. The grief process is characterized as consisting of 5 stages. The first of these is denial, where we simply deny that the loss has even occurred, And the more that we are able to talk about our feelings related to the loss, the less that we stay in the denial stage. People may also deny that they have feelings of grief, which would also be characterized as being in the denial stage. The second emotion that people go through when coping with death is usually anger. Anger is where you may feel angry at the person for dying, or maybe for not taking better care of their health, or you may feel anger at the medical system for not doing a better job in diagnosing and treating them, or you may feel anger at God or the creator or higher power in the universe because they let it happen. So the anger stage is not a good place to be. However, it's really important just to be able to accept whatever stage you find yourself in. And typically people are responding in anger because they are heartbroken and they feel helpless and powerless. So we may actually strike out against people in our life that we're close to that are still alive in this stage. And it's important to be conscious of the tendency to do that for the people that are still left on the planet with us. We also want to be very careful that we do not engage in self-loathing or anger towards ourselves for what we feel was our fault or something we could have done better or anything like that. The next stage that people go through in the loss of a loved one is the stage of guilt. In this stage, people tend to feel bad about the negative things that they have either said or done that could have hurt the person that has died. In this stage, we might go back and look at our actions in the course of a relationship, and we may beat ourselves up and ask ourselves, why couldn't I have done a better job? Or, oh, I should have never done that. We may also feel guilty, perhaps, if we had a relationship with someone that died and we had a process of being estranged from them where we did not have communication. So it's very important to be aware of the guilt tendency, and guilt is also a negative emotion like anger, and both of these emotions can be effectively dealt with by engaging in grief counseling. I personally have gone through the loss of a very important person in my life, and I can say with certainty that if I had not gone to grief counseling, where I was able to get free counseling for a year through hospice, if I had not gone through that counseling, I do not think that I would be doing nearly as well today as I was when the loss occurred. And so I think that I can definitely say with confidence that if you go through the loss of someone that you're very close to, I would really recommend getting grief counseling because it's very difficult to progress through all of these stages by yourself. And sometimes and often it will really help to have someone that is trained in terms of approaches to help people move through these emotions that can be very negative. Culminating with anger and guilt is the experience of depression. Depression is when people are feeling more of a sense of nothing is ever going to be right again. You may feel like you don't even want to be alive anymore, right? Because you lost this person that was so important to you. You may have a difficult time getting out of bed in the morning, wanting to go to your job or school. If you find yourself feeling like you're not interested in the things that you used to like to do, or you find that you have a really negative outlook on life, or that you are engaging in self-destructive behaviors like addictive or substance abuse issues, these are all indicative that you are in depression. And as I've stated before, counseling is extremely effective in helping people to get through negative emotions like anger, guilt, and depression. Now, presuming that people are able to move through the previous stages that we've already talked about, then hopefully at some point people get to the acceptance stage. At the acceptance stage, people are able to acknowledge that things will never be the same again, but we have learned how to cope with the loss of the person that we love, and we have figured out a way to move on with our life so that we can find some positive, good meaning and things that give our life a positive feeling and a positive experience again, right? So I think it's very important for us to be aware of all of these stages. If you have not lost someone that you have been very close to yet in your life, I'm very grateful that you haven't gone through that yet. However, the reality is that most of us will at some point lose people that we are very close to. So I strongly encourage you to be aware of this process. And if you find yourself going through grief, then please do seek out mental health counseling so that you can be successful in moving through the stages so that you can be a full, happy person again. It needs to be stated that there are many people walking around today who are stuck in various stages of the grief process because they did not seek out the right kinds of counseling to move through the 5 stages. So, for example, you may even know someone who is stuck in the anger stage, or they're stuck in the depression stage, and they're using alcohol and drugs to self-medicate to try to feel okay about their life since losing that person, right? It's very good to be aware of these stages so that we can also give good advice to the people that we love. So if you know people who are going through this, who are stuck in a negative stage of anger, guilt, or depression, then don't be afraid to tell them that the experts suggest that when you go through a grief or a loss, that getting grief counseling helps people tremendously to move through these things. Okay? Also, the last thing I want to say about this is it's also possible for you to get to the acceptance stage and then to go back to the anger stage and still feel angry at the person who died, at God, at yourself. You may still feel guilty, and then you might go back to the acceptance stage for a while, and then maybe a memory will come up or something will happen, and that will send you back into the depression stage for a while. So it's also really important to mention that you may be kind of cycling through all of these stages for a while, and maybe even possibly for a long time. So I encourage you to think about this and get the professional help when you need it. So let's look at another theory that allows us to understand why we pursue certain relationships over others. According to the cost-benefit and social exchange theory, people work to maintain their relationships when they perceive that the benefits that they get from a relationship outweigh the costs of the relationship. So what would be some benefits that we might get from a relationship? Well, let's take romantic dating, for example. One benefit we might get would be that the person makes us feel good about ourselves, right? Or you hang out with someone who you have love or affection for. You have someone that you can go out to the beach with, or go to movies with, or go to dinner with, right? You might have other different kinds of benefits that go along with a physically intimate relationship. However, every relationship has costs. So what would be some costs that you might face in a romantic relationship? Well, a cost could take the form of time, right? Most of us know in close relationships that we are expected to dedicate a substantial portion of our time on a daily basis to maintaining those relationships and sharing our time with the person we care about. So you may have a cost of time. Depending on the kinds of leisure activities you engage in, you may have a cost of money, right? Or how much this person likes to spend when you go out. Another cost in the dating world could be the idea of having to be monogamous, right? Is the person that you're getting to know someone that you're willing to stop dating other people for? According to this theory, the benefits of that potential partner need to outweigh the costs, or people are not willing to become monogamous in that relationship. According to this theory, there is a comparison level that we all use when we perceive or when we interpret the cost benefits. The comparison level deals with the expectation of the kinds of rewards and profits that we believe we should be getting from a certain relationship. In comparison, the comparison level for alternatives deals with our view of other potential relationships that we might be able to have and what benefits or rewards we would get from that relationship when it's compared to the current relationship we have or the current relationship that we are using in the comparison level, right? So this is a very interesting theory that allows us to understand the process that humans go through when they are deciding who they are going to date or be monogamous with or marry. And we can also think about this theory in relationship to the people that we choose to be friends with or spend our community engagement time with, right? Or the churches or other community foundations that we choose to go to. We can look at those kinds of relationships from this lens as well. Another very important lens or theory that allows us to understand relationships and the nature of relational development is the dialectical tensions. The dialectical tensions theory allows us to look at the process of individuals having opposing needs that need to be met in the relationship. So when we look at opposing goals or opposing needs, we can look at, for example, the human need for connection or closeness, right? All of us have that need to feel close and connected and to have affection, right? However, human beings, even when they are in close personal relationships, also need to have a sense that they are autonomous or that they can make decisions that they want to make or that they can have the time that they want to have on a daily basis to do the things that are important to them, right? So sometimes you might have people who have different types of needs for connection and for autonomy. And if you find yourself in a relationship like this, whether it's a romantic relationship or a family relationship or even a friendship, you can talk about these different needs that you have, right? And how you can best meet each other's needs by mutual respect and mutual understanding. Another human need that people have is predictability versus novelty. This deals with our ability to have a relationship that allows us to be able to predict what people are going to do, what kinds of situations we will experience, and in general, how things will unfold in the relationship. In comparison to predictability, novelty is the very human need that we have for excitement and spontaneity, right? And doing new things and exciting things. Now, obviously, the best kinds of romantic relationships are able to have both predictability and novelty, as well as connection and autonomy. In addition, human beings have an innate need to self-disclose and to share who they are with other people. So sometimes we have different needs in terms of being open and sharing versus having a need to have privacy or to keep our ideas and our feelings to ourselves. You may find this in certain married couple situations, right? Perhaps one of the people in the relationship wants to talk a lot about their feelings or talk a lot about a certain issue and really share and get close and unpack stuff, right? And maybe the other person in the relationship doesn't really want to go there, or they're just not comfortable talking about their feelings that much, and they just prefer not to discuss those kinds of topics. Now, obviously, we need to be able to be both open and also to be able to keep things to ourselves as well, right? Sometimes people think that more communication is always better, and I would like to tell you that actually more communication is not always better. Sometimes it's a really good idea to keep a very negative, judgmental, demeaning thought that you're having about another person to yourself. I always suggest that we try to run something through our brain in terms of imagining what it would feel like to be hearing someone say the same thing to us before we say something, especially negative information, especially information that could really hurt somebody or have a negative impact on the relationship. On the other hand, We do not want to be deliberately withholding information that is something that is a fair thing for our partner to want to have, right? So there's always this sort of balance between connection and autonomy, predictability, novelty, and openness and privacy. And the way that we can achieve a nice balance from these dialectics in our relationships is by being honest and respectful, and by being willing to compromise with the people that we care about. Resolving the tensions that are inherent in dialectical tensions in relationships is definitely possible, and we should always go in with an attitude that seeks to understand instead of seeks to judge. Obviously, we all know that lying is not good for relationship development and for relational closeness. Now, sometimes we may lie because we find ourselves in a situation where we feel trapped between a rock and a hard place, right? So you may have done something that maybe you knew you shouldn't do, and then to cover it up, you told a little white lie, but then somebody finds out about the white lie, and then you have to tell a bigger lie to cover up that lie. And, just the story of Pinocchio in our culture really emphasizes the fact that we all know that we should not be lying in general with the people we care about, right? However, the reality is that on a daily basis, many of us will tell little white lies, even if it's not to the people that we're close to, but you may tell a lie that looks like equivocating language. This is where we may use language purposely in a vague manner in order to finesse a response or to make it sound better than it actually is. So people can equivocate in all sorts of manner, but let's say that you went out to lunch with a colleague and you're in a monogamous romantic relationship with someone, and you have been for a while, and you end up going out to lunch with your colleague and maybe a few other people from work, and you know that it was a innocent enough interaction and there was no plan to spend time with the person in the future, that you didn't even sit next to them, whatever, right? But when your partner asks you later that day, oh, well, what did you end up doing for lunch? You might, instead of saying, oh, well, we all went and had lunch, you might just say something like, oh, just grabbed some lunch and went back to my desk. Or, oh, just grabbed some lunch quickly, that one restaurant down at the end of the block. So rather than explicitly stating that you went with your coworker and your coworkers, you might just omit that word from the statement, and that's a way that people can equivocate. It's obviously clear to most of us at this point that deception changes the relationship, okay? Now, when people discover that they have been lied to, they may go through a whole host of emotional responses and cognitive realizations about you and about the relationship. In general, lying really can break down the trust in a relationship, and it goes without saying that it depends on the severity of the lie, right? Like how much of a lie is it? It also depends on the intensity or the severity of the situation, right? Sometimes people may just not tell someone something that they know the person would expect to know, right? Maybe they just, they don't actually come out and lie and say, well, no, I didn't go to lunch with them. They might just not mention the lunch at all, right? And then so that's a way of being deceptive, because obviously you should be able to feel when you go home at the end of the day that you can tell your main partner the things that you did that day, right? And if you feel like you can't tell them, then that's something worth looking at as well. Why do I feel the need to lie, either about this relationship, or why do I feel the need to lie to this person that I'm in a relationship with? And one thing we also want to think about is the lies that we might tell ourselves about our own life or the relationships we have, or any number of things, right? So I would really think about this issue. I think that in general, most of us really try to be upfront, honest people. If you find that you have a very hard time not lying, then that would be a really great topic to take to a counselor to help you understand more why it is that you tend to use that coping strategy to deal with any number of situations, right? Similarly, if we find ourselves in a relationship with someone who lies a lot, then I would strongly encourage people to really look at that and to start to try to understand why it is that they feel the need to lie to us. And hopefully you would be able to resolve whatever issue was going on in the relationship that would cause or contribute to that. However, if not, then that would definitely be something you want to look at in terms of the costs and the benefits of a relationship, right? So I think these are all things to think about and are very important. And I think your book has some interesting questions. When they get to the end of this section, they say, in your opinion, is it harmful, unethical, or immoral to consciously lie, deceiving others or yourself? Okay, well, yeah, sure, I can stand here and I can say it's harmful and it's immoral for me to lie to myself about any number of things in life, right? All of us tell ourselves lies, and that's a part of the reason we take classes like this and we go and do self-exploration and we read books about self-help, right? Is we want to, become more conscious, responsible, full people, right? So, would you ever want someone to lie to you? Is the next question. And I think that's a really interesting thing to consider. And then they conclude with, what would you never be willing to lie about to another person or yourself? So I think that this is something that's definitely worth considering. In general, it's good to be as conscious and aware as we can in our relationship with ourselves and in our relationship with other people. And so as we move through this chapter, you can be integrating this idea of building trust into your knowledge about relationship development. So in conclusion, let's talk through some of the very practical things that we can do in our day-to-day communication with others so that we can have more effective communication and more satisfying relationships. The first thing that we can do is we can actively seek information from others by asking good questions, by reading between the lines, and by looking for nonverbal cues that may help us understand more about what people may be feeling in a certain situation. We also want to recognize that relationships evolve and change over the course of our life. It is very good to be able to accept this because in your life, you will probably find that there are some relationships that you have today that you will not have in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and things like that. Sometimes we think that we will always have someone in our life, but even with the people who we are so close to, such as our family and our partners, even in those relationships, they may end up passing into the next spiritual realm before we do, right? So I would say that work to always appreciate the people that are in your life. And if there comes a time when you realize that it's the end of the road for a friendship or perhaps a romantic relationship, or maybe even you need to learn to set better boundaries with your family so that you can be a happier, more well-adjusted person, then it's okay to do that. It's okay to move through the different stages of relationships and to not assume all the responsibility for making a relationship work, because the reality is that it takes two people to make a relationship work. And so recognizing that all relationships evolve and change can be a very liberating thing for some of us who have gone through the loss of various relationships in our lives. Another thing that I hope that you take away from this lecture is that we want to know when to end a relationship. So, when should we end a relationship? Well, this is a very personal decision. It's not for me to generalize and try to make a blanket statement for you to take home and use in terms of evaluating whether you should continue to stay in a relationship or not. However, several of the models that we have looked at in this chapter allow us the ability to look at our relationship progression through different stages that these models provide, right? That might help us figure out where we're at in a relationship with someone and where we want to go. We can also look at things like the cost-benefit issue that we were allowed to discuss. And the cost-benefit thing looks at things like, what are we getting from the relationship in terms of support and love and acceptance versus what are the costs, right? And in general, I would say that if you are in relationships where you feel devalued, you feel mistreated, you feel that people don't care about you, or at least don't want to communicate with you in a way where you feel cared about, then I would say that's a very good time to really take a serious look at whether that relationship is something that you want to continue. Choosing to be in the right relationships in life is probably one of the most important decisions that we can make in order to become full, happy, healthy, well-adjusted people. And so this issue is something we could probably have a 5-hour discussion on, but I think that the models that are provided in this chapter and some of the different concepts and ideas that we've talked about, such as things related to emotions and also things related to deception and managing emotions effectively, these are all things that we want to consider. Now, obviously, if we are in a relationship that is emotionally or physically abusive, it is probably in our best interest to seek support and to actively figure out a way to either get the person in the kind of professional counseling that they need to stop doing that kind of behavior, or it's probably a good idea for us to consider distancing ourselves from these kinds of people. I have also discussed the importance of seeking counseling in order to move through the process of grief. I also advocate seeking counseling to help you figure out what to do with a relationship. Counselors are extremely useful in terms of providing an objective and safe space where we can talk about the issues that may challenge us, and we have a safe place to go through it with someone who is a trained professional who can help us learn to identify, for example, toxic communication that may be taking place. And once we can learn to identify it, then we can ask people to treat us in a more loving manner. And then if they choose not to at that point, then it is our decision to figure out whether we want to continue the relationship. In general, it's good to just recognize that communication is really the lifeblood and the source of what forms and sustains relationships. So what this means is we should always do our best to bring ourselves to the table from a loving, open perspective. We should seek to understand and not to judge, and we should always try to treat people in the manner that we ourselves would like to be treated. I think that if you can approach most communication situations with mutual respect and care, then you will find that you'll have a more optimum interaction and you will be able to build closer relationships when compared to communicating with people with a defensive or judging perspective. Thank you very much for your time in this lecture. I hope that it's useful for you, and I encourage you to continue to work on improving your communication with yourself and with other people.